For centuries, using a fork was considered a direct insult to God and a scandalous display of weakness. This simple tool was once banned by royalty and mocked as a ridiculous Italian luxury. How did a piece of metal transform from a high society scandal into something that literally reshaped the human jaw? Right now, there's probably a fork within arm's reach of you. Maybe it's in a kitchen drawer, sitting in a dishwasher, or stabbed into last night's leftover pasta. You don't think twice about picking one up. But if you'd done that same thing 1,000 years ago, people would have called you a heretic, a sinner, or worse, someone too delicate to eat with their bare hands like God intended. The fork has one of the strangest origin stories of any object we use every day. And trust me, it gets weirder than you think. Let's rewind to the early Middle Ages. Picture a European banquet around the 10th or 11th century. A long wooden table, piles of roasted meat, bread, thick stews. And everyone, from peasants to nobles, is eating with their hands. Maybe they have a knife. Maybe they have a spoon. But fingers? Those are the main event. This wasn't just laziness or a lack of technology. This was theology. The Catholic Church had made it very clear. God gave human beings fingers. 10 of them, in fact. Those fingers were divine tools, created specifically so that mankind could touch and consume the food that the Lord provided. To use an artificial implement, some pronged metal device, was to say that God's design wasn't good enough. It was vanity. It was arrogance. And in an era where the church dictated virtually every aspect of daily life, that kind of arrogance could get you into serious trouble. Now, forks did exist at this time, just not in Western Europe. Over in the Byzantine Empire, the eastern half of what had been the Roman world, wealthy elites had been using small two-pronged forks for a while. These weren't like the forks you and I know. They were tiny, delicate, more like a miniature pitchfork. They were designed for spearing individual pieces of food, not for scooping or cutting. And in Constantinople, they were considered a mark of sophistication. Which brings us to one of the most dramatic dinner stories in all of human history. In the year 1004, or 1005 depending on the source, a Byzantine princess named Maria Argyropulena traveled to Venice to marry Giovanni, the son of the Doge of Venice. She was royalty. She was wealthy. And she brought with her a set of golden forks. When she sat down at her wedding feast and began eating with this golden fork instead of her fingers, the Venetian court was absolutely scandalized. The clergy were outraged. One prominent church figure, St. Peter Damian, later wrote about the incident with barely concealed disgust. He described her fork use as an excessive delicacy and a sign of grotesque vanity. She was too good to touch food with her own God-given hands? Who did she think she was? Then, not long after the wedding, Maria fell ill and died. And the church had its verdict. Peter Damian essentially declared that her death was divine punishment. God had struck her down for the sin of using a fork. Her refusal to eat with her hands, the way the Creator intended, had sealed her fate. That was the story the church told, and for centuries, it stuck. Now think about what that meant for the fork's reputation. This wasn't just a utensil that people found unnecessary. It was actively cursed. It was the devil's tool. A two-pronged instrument that resembled a pitchfork, literally Satan's weapon. Using one wasn't just weird. It was spiritually dangerous. And meanwhile, the way most people actually ate was, by our standards, pretty intense. Communal eating was the norm across medieval Europe. People shared large bowls and platters. You reached into a central dish with your hands, tore off a piece of meat, and ate it. Bread often served as both plate and utensil. Thick slices called trenchers soaked up sauces and juices. If you were wealthy, you might have a personal knife to cut your food. But forks? Absolutely not. The two-pronged design that the Byzantines used was impractical anyway. Food slipped off easily. It was fiddly. And it looked, to European eyes, completely ridiculous, like trying to eat dinner with a tiny weapon. So, for about 400 years after Maria's fatal fork debut, the device remained basically absent from Western European tables. But here's where the story starts to shift. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Something was changing in Italy. The Renaissance was beginning to reshape how people thought about art, science, philosophy, and manners. Italian city-states like Florence, Venice, and Rome were becoming cultural powerhouses. And with that cultural refinement came a new attitude toward dining. Wealthy Italian families began to see the fork not as a blasphemous object, but as a mark of civilization. If you were educated, if you were cultured, if you appreciated beauty and order, then why wouldn't you eat with precision and elegance? Forks started appearing on the tables of Italian nobles. They evolved from 2 prongs to 3, and eventually 4, which made them far more functional. Food didn't slide off as easily. You could actually scoop and hold things. But the rest of Europe? They thought the Italians had lost their minds. When Catherine de' Medici married King Henry II of France in 1533, she brought Italian dining customs with her, including forks. The French court took one look at these dainty little instruments and burst out laughing. Real men didn't use forks. Forks were for the weak. French nobles mocked them as an absurd Italian affectation, the kind of thing only a soft, overly refined society would bother with. This attitude persisted for a long time. When a British traveler named Thomas Coriati visited Italy in 1608 and returned to England raving about forks, he was mercilessly ridiculed. People gave him the nickname furcifer, a Latin pun that combined the word for fork with a term for rascal. The joke was clear: only a fool would use a fork. And yet, quietly, things were starting to change. As trade routes expanded and European nations grew wealthier, dining began to evolve from a purely functional act into a social performance. Table manners started to matter. The idea that you should keep your hands clean, that you shouldn't reach across someone else to grab food, that individual portions were more hygienic than communal bowls. These ideas were gaining ground. By the 17th century, forks had become standard in Italian households across social classes. France eventually caved. After a century of resistance, the French aristocracy adopted the fork, and soon it became a symbol of French refinement rather than Italian eccentricity. England followed, somewhat grudgingly, by the early 18th century. And from there, the fork spread across the Western world. But here's what's really fascinating. The fork didn't just change how we eat. It changed what we eat. And it may have even changed our faces. Once forks became widespread, food preparation shifted. Cooks no longer had to serve everything in large, hand-friendly chunks. Meat could be cut into smaller pieces before serving. Vegetables could be prepared in ways that required precise utensil work. Entire cuisines evolved around the assumption that diners would have a fork in hand. Think about pasta. The way we twirl spaghetti around a fork is a technique that only makes sense in a fork-using culture. And then there's the jaw theory. Some researchers have argued that the widespread adoption of forks and knives, the shift from tearing food with our teeth to cutting it into small, manageable bites, actually contributed to changes in human jaw structure. Before forks and knives were common, people used their front teeth much more aggressively. They bit, they tore, they gnawed. That heavy use kept the jaw muscles strong and the dental arch wide. But as food became softer, pre-cut, and more refined, our jaws had less work to do. Over generations, jaw sizes may have decreased, teeth became more crowded, and the overbite, which was relatively rare in ancient populations, became common. Professor Charles Loring Brace of the University of Michigan studied this phenomenon extensively and found that the overbite became standard in Western European populations roughly 250 years after the fork became widely adopted in each region. In China, where chopsticks had been performing a similar function for much longer, the overbite appeared about 900 years earlier. The timing is striking. The tools we eat with may have literally reshaped the human skull. Today, roughly a third of the world eats with forks, a third with chopsticks, and a third with their hands. Each method carries its own cultural weight, its own rituals, its own history. But the fork's journey from blasphemous luxury to household essential is arguably the most dramatic transformation of any eating utensil in history. It's a story about power, about who gets to decide what's civilized and what isn't. It's a story about religion and its grip on even the smallest details of daily life. It's a story about fashion, about how the things we consider embarrassing in one century become indispensable in the next. And most of all, it's a reminder that the objects we take for granted, the ones so ordinary we never even think about them, often have the wildest histories hiding in plain sight. So the next time you pick up a fork, take a second to appreciate what you're holding. 1,000 years ago, that simple piece of metal could have gotten you condemned by the church, mocked by kings, or blamed for your own death. Now it's just the thing you use to eat your salad. Funny how that works. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the secret history of the fork, do me a favor, smash that like button and subscribe. I make videos like this every week, uncovering the bizarre stories behind everyday objects. Drop a comment and tell me, what other ordinary thing do you want me to investigate? I'll see you in the next one.